the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Hello everybody. Dear Dr. Prue Holmes, dear Dr. Jane Andrews, our distinguished guest speakers for today, dear guests in the UK, dear colleagues in IUG, and dear students, all of you are most welcome to this gathering. It gives me great pleasure to extend to you all a hearty and a very warm welcome on behalf of our beloved English department at IUG. Today is a special day. Today we at IUG and the University of Glasgow are delighted, are happy to continue our online seminar series entitled Crossing Borders of Foreign Language Education and Translation in Palestine. This series, as you might know, is part of the project Researching Multilingually at the borders of the body, language, law, and the state. The title for today's seminar is Thinking Through the Impacts of the Globalization of English. What are the implications for the teaching and learning of languages? And what are the opportunities for working with multiple languages in research projects? Our distinguished guest speakers for today are Dr. Prue Holmes from the University of Durham and Dr. Jane Andrews from the University of West England. Please, first of all, join hands to extend a warm welcome and thanks to both of them. I'd like also to express my thanks to Dr. Nazmi al-Masri, the co-investigator and consultant of this project, and I leave it to him to introduce Dr. Prue Holmes.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Dr. Mahmoud.
You're welcome.
And we're absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to have this seminar with you. And also, dear Dr. Nazmi, we're looking forward to seeing you soon in Durham. And hello to all the students sitting there. It's lovely to see you, and we're looking forward to talking with you today. I'd just like to show you the students I've got in the room here with me, some of my master's students, and waving at the back is Mariam, who's the research associate on our project. So these are students, and we're really delighted that we've come here today to share the presentation with you. So we're looking forward to hearing from you later on. Pass to Jane now.
Thank you very much.
All of you are most welcome. Yes, please, Dr. Nazmi.
In Gaza, and welcome from us in Bristol as well. It's really perfect that in a project about language and communication, we can communicate together like this using the technology that we've got today. So it's a very special occasion for us as well. I'm afraid the reach of our camera isn't very big, but I'd like to share that we have a nice collection of staff and students from University of the West of England, and we're going to enjoy having discussions together across our 3 sites and together during our presentation today. So thank you for coming along, and I'll pass back to Prue to begin our presentation.
Okay, I'm going to get started. So if you could turn to the next slide, Languages Under Pressure and Pain. This slide just introduces our project, and we had an initial project, network project at the beginning, and then we joined with Alison on this much larger project, and Jane and I are part of this project, and we are looking at methodologies around researching multilingually. So you've probably heard quite a bit about it from Nazmi, so I'll move on to the next slide. Slide number 3, the preview. So we're going to start by thinking about languages and globalisation, in particular thinking about English as a lingua franca and critiquing some of the ideas around English as a lingua franca. Jane's going to talk about issues of language learning and teaching, a little bit in the UK context, and then we're going to break for a question-answer session after about 40 minutes. In the second half, we're going to look more at the work Jane and I and Mariam have been doing on exploring the roles of languages in the research projects and finishing off with the question-answer session. Slide number 4, introducing the idea of language, culture, identity work, and what are the implications for translation. As you know, and as we hear at the moment, migratory flows of people across borders are commonplace, and new lingua cultures, new languages and cultures and communities are being constructed everywhere. So Karen Riesager in Denmark talks about the idea of these transnational communities and the idea of lingua cultures being established within these communities. Another aspect concerns internationalization, and I know in Gaza you're very interested in this as you set up your TASOL program of bringing in other students to the Gaza University. So in Durham we've got lots of international students in our class this morning in our master's programs. So internationalization is quite commonplace in many universities in the Western world and in other countries, in China too. We also see the emergence of universities teaching in English, for example in Korea and Japan. And even in Australia and New Zealand, sometimes workshops take place in Chinese because of the internationalization of languages. So what are the implications for lingua francas and more for our project, Researching Multilingually? The next slide, 5. I'm going to talk a little bit about a book that is coming out that I've been working on with my colleague Fred Durham at the University of Helsinki. And we've looked at the intercultural and cultural dimensions of English as a lingua franca. So just introducing the idea of English as a lingua franca, it's not specific to English, of course, so some myths about it. And lingua franca communication is not new. People from the beginning of time have been using a lingua franca to communicate. And people who share a same language do not always speak the same language and do not always understand one another. So a few myths there to expose. Turning to the next slide, 6. The cultural and intercultural dimensions, and that's what we're interested in our book. So can we just talk about English as a lingua franca without thinking about the cultural and intercultural aspects of that? So what about the historical, political, economic and organizational structures that assert and or require preference of one language over another, or even one language form? So Tawana, for example, in our project up in Glasgow, talks about the idea of cultivating a correct English language. What does that mean? Of course, there are many different Englishes. Understanding the norms of communication in and through English. What does that mean? Knowing the cultures of English-speaking countries. Is this a possibility? Can we think of there being strict norms? Okay, so are these reified? Are they structuralist, put there by structures and imposed by certain systems and regimes? They might be idealized. You need a particular way of speaking English. And they're unauthentic and unrealistic meanings of communication in Englishes and in languages more generally. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm actually speaking with a New Zealand accent because I come from New Zealand. However, of course, in New Zealand, people would say, oh, you sound British. But as soon as I speak here, people know I'm either from Australia or New Zealand. So, what does it mean to speak English as a lingua franca? Going on to the next slide, number 7, the cultural and intercultural dimensions continuing in the educational context. So what are the notions of good English or correct English? These can often be perpetuated by state and private language regimes in other countries. So within the book itself, Eric Henry talks about the role of the global Oriental English schools in China and how they perpetuate a certain idea about English. And of course there are language teaching systems such as IELTS that demand a certain level of English to study abroad. And then the idea that study abroad is in order to acquire native-like proficiency, again, usually determined by the economic status of individuals who can afford such language acquisition, such language training. And then, if we think about the common European framework of reference, this whole system coming out of the Council of Europe has been highly influential in setting levels of what is expected in order to even immigrate to a certain country in some situations. And of course in China, the CET4 exam system in the second year favours grammatical proficiency and linguistic knowledge over communication in English. So there are all sorts of problems around English. Moving on to the next slide, Monolingual University. Hi Sarah. In the UK context, there are some unspoken assumptions about English in universities. For example, thinking about supervisory practice around research projects and around postgraduate qualifications, there is the assumption that English is the norm. Whether a student uses languages in their lit review, their data collection, transcription analysis, in the research process, usually this is not even discussed. It's just somehow an assumption that the student will go away and manage the process for themselves. There is the expectation that theses will be written and presented in English. There are no policies around the inclusion of other languages. And often for academics coming from other countries, the preferred language of publication is English, and this is often tied to status and promotion expectations. Oral examinations inevitably take place in English, despite the language of the candidate. And there is no agreement on what constitutes correct English in academic writing in our university. Yet, many postgraduate students in universities in the English-speaking world do not have English as their first language. So these are areas that are largely undiscussed in our academic context. The students are just nodding as if saying yes. Come and speak good English. Okay, going to the next slide. Thinking about what does it mean to be a NELF, an English as a lingua franca speaker. So do you think about, when you're using English languages, how they are shaped and constructed in interactions and intercultural encounters? What are the cultural and intercultural dimensions of your communication? What about identities, people's identities? They are, in a sense, socially constructed as we come together, and they're contextually constructed in the environments we're working in. And they're influenced by history and geography, the small culture of the university, or the micro-communities in which you engage in, whether you have your Chinese group or your other international group. So what memories do you bring about your own culture and learning a new language? What about culture itself? What kind of resistance are there to categories of difference and to the idea of national culture? What does it mean to be human together? What do we share as part of our history, our culture, our religious identity, and so forth, and the memories that inscribe the cultures and the societies in which we live in? What's shared and what's unshared? Usually, what is shared is the basis for how we come together and understand one another. And even thinking about our individual agency, how can our own identities and multiple identities shape the way we engage with one another? And of course, what power relations exist among us and within the institutions that also we're studying within. The next slide, thinking about power relations.
Discrimination, inequalities, and social injustice. So how are power relations related to discourses of culture, and how are these expressed? How are they co-constructed and enacted? How are hierarchies created, and what are their consequences on people and language choices? Educators, researchers, and decision makers have a duty to help language users to diffuse such situations of power imbalance and to provide them with the tools to do so. How might intercultural pedagogies encourage ELF users and teachers to take action and ethical, responsible communicators? And we know, we've seen a lot of the work that's going on in Gaza at the moment with the tassel pedagogies, and Mariam's been working on this with you in Gaza and with Grazia and Katia and Alison up in Glasgow on thinking about the kinds of pedagogies that address the power issues around English as a lingua franca, and thinking about multiple languages, multimodality in the language learning process. Really fascinating. Coming on to language learning and teaching. Okay, so there are multiple languages as lingua francas. So we need to think about the decentering of target language countries. And I think that the TASOL work that you're doing there is going a long way towards challenging these power positions of English as a lingua franca. And what are the interrelationships of languages and cultures with other countries and with other people and with other groups in a global historical perspective? So we need a much more dynamic and fluid approach as we think about this, and as we recognise the multifarious nature of intercultural communication, particularly in English as a lingua franca scenarios, but in all shared language scenarios and in multimodal scenarios too, thinking about Braille and sign language. Developing learners' understandings of global citizenship and critical awareness of cultural and linguistic complexity is really important. So Researcher, for example, does a lot of research on the idea of Danish as a lingua franca and Danish communities worldwide and how that language is used as a lingua franca. And then teaching about intercultural awareness, skills, knowledge and attitudes to accommodate teachers' experiences and learners' needs. Baker talks about that in his chapter in our book. And so all up, we're thinking about not just English and language as communication, but the intercultural aspects of communication too, and the situated contextual nature of communication. Coming on to the political implications, the next slide. Researchers and teachers need to be aware of how governments, examination systems in universities and schools promote a native speaker model. So Reagan in the commentary chapter is quite critical of these power positions of institutions. And if you think about parents, what role do they have? They often prefer a native speaker model, but who can become a native speaker? Children will then have to access the access to the capitalist world of global elites. So who's using this English as a lingua franca? It's international students, it's business people, it's tourists, the world on which current empirical ELF research is focused. So he also attacks the focus of ELF research. So for language learners, what is the status and the linguistic or even economic potential of learning a non-native speaker form of English? How individuals learn and use languages is determined by individuals' local experiences and the extent to which they adopt the social practices around them, rather than some abstracted, monolithic and imposed supranational variety of language. So Hall promotes the idea of a more pluralistic view of languages, that there shouldn't be one imposed English as a lingua franca language. And so coming on to the idea of languages and interculturality, the next slide, slide 13. So as we can see, Languages are shaped and constructed in interaction and intercultural encounters. Using and understanding language and communication goes beyond these static, reified, normative and discrete forms of language and interaction that are often imposed by language systems such as IELTS or CET4 or even government. Language must account for individuals' intersubjectivities, their own agency and their own identities, which of course are influenced by the context that you are working in, your history, your geography, the languages around you, your culture, religion, and the multiple identities that we all have, social class, economics, power, and belonging. So then how can we speak of any lingua franca or language without also accounting for these intersubjective and the intercultural aspects of lingua franca language? And we should probably add to that the multimodal aspects of language, as in Braille and sign language, when we think about the TASL program that you're working on there. So those are some of the issues that we've been looking at in this book. So trying to go beyond the idea of just focusing on language, but looking much more at the political and cultural and social structures around language. And now, we're going to pass to Jane.
Thank you very much, Prue. And if we look at the next slide, what I thought would be interesting now is to just take a critical perspective on one context of language learning, thinking about language teaching and learning in schools in England and at the current time, because I think there's some interesting challenges and difficulties in a way that are raised by the issues that Prue has just mentioned to do with language, lingua franca, and the status of English in the world. So I thought it would be interesting just to point out a few of the characteristics of language teaching in schools in England at the moment. So one of them is that there are changing, in recent past, there have been changing perspectives on the official position on the importance of languages in the school curriculum. So for instance, between 2004 and 2010, just in England this is, there was a commitment by the government that all children aged between 7 and 11 should have provision of language learning, foreign language learning that is, but there wasn't an entitlement during that period, which, you know, when I've mentioned this before in international context, people are sometimes quite surprised about that. So children in England, some of them had teaching of, for instance, French, or possibly in some cases Arabic, sometimes Polish, but there wasn't an entitlement to that teaching. Similarly, between 2004 and 2011, young people aged between 14 and 18 didn't have modern languages as a compulsory part of their curriculum. So again, some people might be quite surprised about this. Why is that? Is it because we're terribly lazy? Is it because we're not interested? Why is there this ambiguous attitude towards language learning? Things have changed more recently. So the current Minister of Education said recently, the quotation there, I won't read the whole thing, but essentially she's saying there that all children up until the age of 16 need an academic core of subjects, and she does mention a language within that. So in 2016, we've now moved from this ambiguous position to maybe a stronger position on the importance of languages. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is a quotation from the current national curriculum for England, and it talks about Key Stage 2, which is for our children aged between 7 and 11. And you'll see here, again, I won't read down the whole quote there, but this is what children are entitled to, and I'll pick out some things that you might be particularly interested in. So children have an entitlement, and schools can provide teaching in either a modern language or an ancient language. And you know, when we think that through, it raises some quite interesting things. So today's 7-year-olds could be learning Latin or ancient Greek, and that's fine. They could be learning French or Arabic as well. And the focus is on communication, and in the case of ancient civilization, it's an appreciation of those classical civilizations. I'd be interested to all the participants in this seminar a little bit later to hear your opinions on that. Do you think that that is helpful in the 21st century? You may have a different view. I'm implying what my view of that is. Okay, if we can look at the next slide, please. So the question, perhaps for schools in England then, is which language or languages should they choose to put into this entitlement for our young people? And the quotation there is again from a government minister focusing on education, and he said this in July last year. And you know, this has got a nice feel to it, hasn't it? So this is an outward-facing country, and it's important to have high-quality qualifications, not just in French, German, and Spanish. And I think those ones are being mentioned because those are the traditional languages that have been taught in England. I guess we have gone to those languages for geographic reasons, close in neighbouring countries. But so this ministry is saying, well, we've got other languages too. We've got Polish, Urdu, Arabic, Bengal, Gujarati and Turkish. So those are getting mentioned. And you can see that schools are being encouraged to think a bit more broadly in terms of the languages they offer to children. If we can go on to the next slide, please. What I put here is I thought it would be important that I don't stereotype what's going on in England, and that there are many people who are very keen on the importance of languages in education, and often we need to go to campaigns and voluntary groups to find that enthusiasm for language teaching and learning. So here's one example of a campaign, and I've put their website there if you're interested in looking it up, called Speak to the Future. So it's got quite a nice vision in their outlook, and they have various objectives about language teaching and learning, and this idea is that there isn't one language that is better than any other language. So one of their objectives is that every language should be valued as an asset. So there shouldn't be a sense that some of our communities have languages that are just not as important as others. And so the statement there, I think, is quite positive and outward-looking. This will encourage policymakers and citizens to recognise that the many languages used in the homes of UK citizens are a valuable resource for social cohesion and economic success. So it's got a social side, but it's also got an economic side. So we can trade, we can do business with each other if we're outward looking and we know each other's languages. So there's a range of positions, as you can see there. If we look at the next slide now, please. And I just thought I'd pause a little bit on this question of why might we be going back to ancient languages? And I think, in a sense, we need to look at the history of education in England to perhaps see that there's a prestige value often seen in languages like Latin and ancient Greek. We don't seem to be shaking that off at all. And there is a charitable organisation running Latin programs for teaching Latin in primary and secondary schools, and there's a website there, and they have lots of examples of the benefits, the wider benefits of learning Latin, not just in the language itself, but the benefits for learning in general. So there's a little movement, if you like, in England and the UK more broadly, thinking of languages not just for everyday communication, but for the benefits to cognition and learning. So whether you agree with that or not, there is some thinking like that. So if we can move on now to another slide, please. And I wanted to mention this movement called CLIL. I don't know if any of the language teaching and learning specialists are familiar with this acronym, but it stands for Content and Language Integrated Learning. And the reason for mentioning that is that it's an approach to teaching languages It emphasises teaching curriculum content through a foreign language, and it's quite critiqued in the language learning literature, and it connects back to things that Prue was mentioning about lingua francas and the impact of some languages having a very dominant position in global systems. And it's interesting that some countries, like Spain, have taken on board this movement of CLIL, content and language integrated learning, to such an extent that in some provinces English is used to teach the curriculum entirely. And that has been critiqued quite a lot. Obviously, parents and children who go to those schools are quite happy with that. They're thinking they're getting exposure at a young age to a global language, and this will be very beneficial for their education and future prospects. But on the other side, some people are saying, well, what's going on in those Spanish schools where they're putting over their curriculum to be delivered entirely in another language? And is that entirely a good thing? So, and I was doing a little bit of a Google search on CLIL, and I came across this definition of CLIL, but it's on a website. The website is called Onestop English, and I was thinking, oh, that's quite intriguing in a way, isn't it? Maybe CLIL is almost like a backdoor to promoting, again, the dominance of English. So there are some interesting movements going on at the moment in the language teaching and learning world, not just in the UK but elsewhere, and we can take Prue's critical perspective to that and try to understand it in this critical and global way. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So Prue has developed this, and I'm just going to mediate it to you today, but as we've been talking, I imagine, and you've been thinking yourselves, there is plenty more to discuss and to find out about here. So here is a potential agenda for research and for practice about languages and intercultural communication. So part of that agenda needs to be questioning and investigating how do lingua franca encounters work, how are they inclusive, and as Prue puts in a final bullet point here, what about border crossings, whether geographical or metaphorical border crossings? How do lingua francas operate in those border contexts, whether they're physical borders or contextual borders like schools in border contexts? So there's plenty that we need to think about there, and that leads us into the next slide, where we can have a little pause and a question and answer session here. Now I think we're all going to need to be creative, and we'll negotiate together how we can question and answer each other across our three contexts. But Prue and I thought that there would be two really key ingredients to this question and answer session. One is for all of you to ask Prue or I any questions to clarify anything that we've mentioned so far. So we'd be happy to hear your questions, and if you could please pose a question to one or other of us, and then we'll be able to answer them as best we can. The other thing is we might want to pose questions from audience to audience, and I think that would be rather nice. So if we would like to hear from you Gaza students, that would be lovely. From our students in Bristol, from students and colleagues in Durham, we could pose questions. Might involve us moving around our rooms to get close to the microphones, of course. But can I just start us off then by asking, are there any questions to Prue or I for clarification?
Thank you very much, Dr. Jean and Dr. Prue, for this highly informative seminar. Let us receive some questions or comments from the audience here so far in Gaza, first of all. Any comments, any questions? Please. Yes, we have, I think, here some questions coming through. Dr. Mohammed Al-Hafiz.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It's not a question, rather that's a comment. Okay, you have mentioned the use of English language in mainstream Spanish schools. okay, some schools in Spain have started to use English language in mainstream school. Here in Gaza, we have recently started integrating English in our schools. But again, we are divided, or people are divided, educators are divided. Some say that this is good to start English earlier in early schools or in early education, but others say that this could have an effect. So again, the question or the issue of English dominating, okay, our schools is facing again with some rejection here in Gaza Strip. Okay, we know that English is very important. Okay, and all students need to learn this language. But the problem is, okay, some families, okay, reject the idea, while others approve the idea. So it's a matter of we are between these two extremes. One extreme is in favoring of the integration of English, while the other extreme is not in favor of English language. Yes. Yeah. Okay, or to delay it a little bit. Okay. Yes. This is my comment on this issue.
Thank you. If I can come in there, I think that's a really interesting example, and I'd like to learn more about that. But I think you're right, it is polarised. And on the one hand, you know, we have the research saying the earlier you learn a language, the better you're likely to get. And so that's enticing, isn't it? It's encouraging to think, oh, we should be introducing our children to other languages early. But on the other side, as Prue was saying, language is more than just communication, isn't it? It's an expression of who we are. So if there's a sense of a new language being imposed within schools or on children and families, then that maybe that's a price that's too high to pay. But I liked the way you expressed your point, because you talked about integrating English into the curriculum, and I think maybe that's the way to do it, isn't it? So that English isn't sort of replacing Arabic or other languages. It's integrated, but it has its place that's not bigger than other areas and other languages. So I think my response would be that, yeah, there needs to be some careful thought, and that the backgrounds and identities and well-being and self-esteem of the individuals in whatever country and context is considered quite carefully before the curriculum is totally given over to being delivered in another language, even if it's seen as potentially beneficial. But it's an interesting question. Thank you for that.
If I could step in and make a comment to that too. I think your question's really interesting, and it can be problematic in communities with parents, and I'm thinking of the Hong Kong context where children at the age of 3 start learning English in kindergarten, and then they're tested on it. So it becomes horrific when you think about some of the implications of what it means to learn another language. If I could speak a little bit about the approach in New Zealand regarding Maori. So in the late 80s and early 90s, there was a strong movement towards integrating Maori language and culture into the curriculum. And the way they did it was not to have a Maori class for 3 hours a week or 2 hours a week, starting at the age of 5 or 10 or whenever, but rather, right from the start, from early childcare education, to integrate Maori across the curriculum into all modes of learning, so that all students, all children were exposed to aspects of Maori language and culture, and very much, can I say, the cultural aspects of learning the language too, and what certain customs around practices and certain words. And so my children going to school learned lots of Maori words that are used in everyday language, and these words are used in society now and fully understood in New Zealand by everybody, because they're just part of
everyday life through the curriculum. So that's another way of thinking about language learning.
Thank you for this question to Muhammad, and thank you, Jean and Prue, for this elaboration. I think we can receive some more questions or comments from the audience. I can, yes, to that media.
Okay, I have a question for both Prue and Jane. As experts on intercultural communication education, our students here will be happy if you can provide them with some advice and techniques on how they can develop their intercultural communication competence, so they become globalized learners and globalized communicators in multilingual way rather than only English. We'll be happy. They will be happy to.
This is, by the way, Zionist virus, maybe. Virus Sahiyuni.
I'm afraid I didn't hear the question there. Could we go back over it?
Okay, I'll repeat my question. Our students here at IUG would be happy if you could offer them some piece of advice and also some tips, quick tips on how they can build and develop their intercultural communication ability or competence, so they become globalized learners and globalized international communicators. If, as experts on intercultural education, on intercultural communication, they would be happy to know some advice and tips on that based on your excellent presentations. The answer for the question is for both of you, Prue and Andrew, and Jane and Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To start.
Thanks, Jane. That's a very big question, isn't it? What's the answer? Okay, let's start from the beginning. So, becoming interculturally competent is a lifelong learning process, as it's written in the textbooks and by Deodorf and others. So you can't become interculturally competent overnight. And I guess the things I was talking about at the beginning of my presentation point to the things we need to think about. It's not just being a good technical speaker of language, that I know the grammar and I know all the syntax and I can put sentences together. All of these other things are important in communication. And you'll remember the quotation by O'Shea earlier on, where he said that even people who share the same language may not necessarily understand one another. So understanding and recognizing people's identities, positions, power relations are all important in engaging with others and not making assumptions about the other, resisting essentialist, simplistic stereotypes of the other that are often exported through the media. I think those are the key things that we need to think about. Media representations of the other do not really give the full picture of who an individual is. You have to get to know them and talk to them as individuals.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prue, for this wonderful comment. Yes, Jane, do you have anything to add? Yes, Jane, to add?
Would you like to add something? Would you like to add something, Jane?
I don't think I want to add anything to what Prue said, but I just want to pick up on what Prue said about you know, the intercultural competence being a lifelong skill that develops. And in a sense, I think, you know, it's going back to what Prue said in the first part of the presentation, it's to do with having a space to think that language learning isn't just about the grammar and the pronunciation, but it's about other broader, or it can be about other broader aspects of communication. And when we're designing our language teaching and learning opportunities, to sort of create that space and make sure that we're thinking of communication in a very broad sense, not just a grammar or a pronunciation sense. So that's all really I would like to add.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this comment as well. Yes, you have a question from the female students. Yes, please. Yeah. Yes, sure, from anywhere.
Sorry?
Stand wherever you like, yes.
I'll be fine here. So I wanted to ask, right now, I'm a freelance English trainer myself, and I'm giving a course. Most of my students are graduates or master's students. So my question is, I understand what you said, that English is not about grammar, or communication at least. It's not about grammar, it's not about, you know, correct pronunciation. And I understand that, and that's how I built my course, basically. I'm teaching them every day, you know, communicational English, conversation, basically. It's a conversation class. But my question is because most of my students are planning to, you know, apply for scholarships. Now, should I keep doing what I'm doing, meaning that focusing on everyday English, or should I be more, build my course around the IELTS exam, for example, or an academic purpose? What do you think would be more useful for my students, just keeping in mind that they have a very limited time, basically, to acquire English? So should we focus on everyday English, or should I focus on the IELTS exam or something more academic?
Your name is?
My name is Suha Afif.
Suha.
That's really nice. Do you want to go first, Prue, or shall I?
You go first, Jane.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. That's a really practical and important question for a teacher, isn't it? So, is it focusing on the exam that will help students get their scholarships, or is it everyday communication in the classroom? It would be a shame if it had to be either or, wouldn't it? But I wonder if by practicing the skills that students need to pass their exams, you could bring in, for instance, you know, skills that practice from, you know, examples from literature, possibly. You know, contemporary literature in English. It could be translations, but of everyday scenarios that connect students to these linguistic differences about communication between different groups. So you can just get the students reflecting on what language is like in different contexts, but also you can then extract what they need in order to think about what the IELTS exam is actually asking. I mean, I think one of the good things about the IELTS exam is it's divided into skills. So you can do skills practice, say for instance, based on literature extracts or newspaper extracts. You could role play some of those news stories or you know, scenarios from literature, and that role play you could justify by saying, you know, the speaking practice you're getting is actually going to help you in your exam practice. So I suppose the skillful but tricky thing is to connect everything together and not to see exam teaching as something that is quite different from everyday language use. I know I'm making it sound simple, and it isn't, but I think it's a shame if we're only ever learning in order to pass exams, although the reality is that is often the case, of course. I think that's it from me. Prue, would you like to add something?
Well, only really to reiterate what Jane has said, because your question is a really important one and a difficult one, and a tension that teachers have to deal with on an everyday basis. And I guess, you know, coming back to the critique I started out with about regimes and institutions requiring certain certain levels of English, for example, IELTS or CET 4 in China. And of course, the opposite end of the spectrum is the approach I told you about in New Zealand, where Maori is taught across the curriculum as an everyday social practice that involves culture and intercultural communication. So I think Jane's suggestion of using authentic examples is a very nice way to perhaps get a balance between the rigidity of exam requirements, but also the more intercultural aspects of language learning. And I guess one of the interesting things you could perhaps think about is how is English used in different contexts around the world, and how are the speakers of English using English in those different contexts. And that might be another good, interesting place to start, that it's used by many different people in different places. But I think the points that Jane mentioned are very important, that you somehow can balance. But of course I know that the teacher's role is a challenging one. You have to address the needs of students, you have to address the needs of parents, and scholarships are very important. So it's finding that balance. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sophie Donna. I actually teach a module on English for specific purposes, training the advantage TESOL teachers. And on the module we discuss how teachers can anticipate students' needs. If you have any role in exams, if you have any influence over the exam setting procedures, then of course you can help to ensure that your local exams do actually meet the students' needs, because of course the starting point is always anticipating what those students' needs are. My view is actually that a large proportion of any students in any language class might find authentic materials, particularly related to current affairs, quite difficult. But if they are given materials which relate more specifically, for example, to their speaking needs, that might motivate them. So if they're role-playing, for example, situations they are likely to be in the future, that might, even if they find the material quite difficult, they would be more motivated to learn in that situation. Fortunately, on the bright side, as other people have pointed out, IELTS and other exams are improving all the time, and they do tend to focus on skills which are very useful in everyday life. So, yes, I would say the key is to actually anticipate how students will be needing languages in terms of their speaking skills, listening skills, what will they need to be listening to, etc., not just to pass the exams within their future lives.
Thanks, Sylvie.
Yes, thank you, Suha and Sophie. Yes, that question. One last question maybe from the audience here from our end. Yes, okay. Nora.
Hello. Well, my question is, it's multidimensional. First, I'd like, when we say culture and language, we say that each language represents a different culture, basically. Now, when we say each language has different dialects, so each dialect could have a certain culture. As a person who does not speak English, as learners of English, which culture are we going to learn? Which language are we going to learn? Doesn't that cause problems? And if so, how can we fix them? For example, we have American English, we have British English, we have Australian English. So if I'm going to learn English, which of these should I learn? And if I learn, for example, British English, does that break the whole, what's the word? Like, would that...
System or...
No.
Cultural.
Okay, I missed the point. Anyhow, so how do I overcome such thing? Which culture do I get involved in? Like, if I learn American English, I might not be able to speak with a British person in the right way. I might say something that is American related and not British accepted.
Okay, Sylvie's quite keen to answer that question.
Sorry, this is really my area of expertise. I taught English in Japan in a group of about 40 instructors, 20 of whom were British and 20 of whom were American. I also have a publishing I brought out British and American editions of books. So this has been an area of interest for me for a very long period of time. Essentially, it doesn't matter because there is a great deal of commonality between British English and American English, and the areas of difference are minimal, absolutely minimal. On the programme I just mentioned in Japan, where I was teaching alongside American colleagues, both the British and the American instructors used British and American course books. Clearly didn't differentiate, there's no point in doing that. So I think what you should be aiming to do if you're a student of English is just aim to learn standard forms. Prue mentioned that sometimes people speaking English may not understand each other, but really we're talking about, say, someone from Scotland speaking to someone from Texas. So if you've got a very strong dialectal form in British English or American English or Australian, New Zealand English, wherever, then that's going to present difficulties. So, we would encourage people just to study fairly neutral forms of language. I mean, I do tend to believe that it's possible to learn a core of language. So I wouldn't waste time learning idioms or any informal language because it's not going to be particularly useful on an international level. That would be my view on that.
Jane, do you want to say something?
I'd like to chip in there because I think it's an interesting question, and I think there is an identity aspect to it as well. So I take Sylvie's point that maybe we don't need to worry too much about the details, but on the other hand, a learner might take a particular position and think, how do I want to sound when I'm using that other language? And I once worked very closely with a Hungarian teacher of English, and she said, I don't want to sound American, I don't want to sound British, I want to sound like myself, with my identity speaking English. So she didn't want a new identity, she just wanted a new version of herself in this other language. So I thought that was quite distinctive and intriguing that she had her own personal position on how she wanted to sound. And perhaps there's something of that in this question. What kind of identities do our learners want to project of themselves? How do they want to present themselves? I don't know if that helps.
I'm just thinking, I've got, in my class here, I have got students who all have English as an additional language, and you've all learnt English in different contexts. So I've got our lovely Chinese students here from China, and he's from Norway. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share with the students in Gaza about learning English? Can we start over here?
I find that very interesting to think about it because in China we also have this problem that, well, sometimes in school students they use British textbooks, but after they enter high school or so, students might realize that they prefer American accents because they watch more American soap operas and movies. They're very dominating, so they might prefer American accents. But some of them will prefer British accents too, but they don't really have a particular understanding of each language, personal preferences. They may not think about presenting their own identity sometimes because it's just a thought, preference. So yeah, I think they have the same problem there too.
Okay. Do you want to say anything?
So I'm from Norway, and in my country it's a very strong focus on Queen's English, or the perfect Oxford standard English. And after living here in Durham and living at college where there are about 100 nationalities, and also taking this module here during university being very valuable for me about intercultural communication. I think some people might argue that my English has gotten worse because, because I'm influenced by so many ways of speaking English. But I think my English and my identity has gotten stronger because I'm not focused on grammar and linguistics, but more about communication. And I think I'm taking the power balance out of my language and my way of expressing myself.
Very nice, thank you. Thanks. Jane?
Prue, you've got a question here from one of our participants in Bristol. Out of here, over to you.
Yes, my name is, could I start?
Yes.
Yes, my name is Al-Tahir. I would like to first of all to thank the organizer of this event and to give us this great opportunity to be in contact direct with Gaza and with other people here in the UK. And I would like to mention something very important for me, is that English language is an imperialist language. It's an imperialist language and is imposed to get the job done regarding economic and business issues, import-export, since the discovery of telegraph, railway, and a long history of colonization, and so on. And I would like to hear that during the discussion, really, because I think it's very relevant and important point to take into account, especially nowadays, we got this romance of learning Chinese because the Chinese is in a fire to dominate the world in business and economic issues. And the second issue, now we are using all of us English language as a lingua franca, but I think it's more than that. It's sharing values and sharing culture background to some extent, which is related to English. Even original, some of us are not English, it's very clear, but the cultural background of a language is very important to have into account. And thank you very much for our brothers. Assalamu alaikum in Gaza. And it's opportunity to be in contact direct with you. We really would like to thank the organizer. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Mr. Tahir, to hear your lovely insights about the English language and also to hear your lovely sound. I think you're from Saudi Arabia or Sudan, I'm not sure. From Libya. Libya.
Sudan.
Yes, I am originally from Sudan.
Yes, Tahir is a Sudanese name now. Culture and identity. I think it's time now to proceed with the second session, unless Dr. Nazmi insists on asking or commenting.
If you allow me to add some points to, in fact, the questions raised regarding language and culture, and which language to learn and which culture to learn. I think Noor gave a valid question where she talked about language has different dialects and language has cultures, and every dialect has a culture as well. This is a valid argument. Let me say, or try to answer her question by saying, now in English we learn English for general purposes and English for specific purposes. We can apply the same way to learning culture for general purposes and culture for specific purposes. For example, if you are intending to go to the UK, then the priority is to learn British culture and British English. If you plan to study in another country, it would be suitable to learn about that country. However, now in this globalized communication, where universities and educators, specialists, experts specialized in intercultural communication, we try to produce globalized and international students. So there something will be very general knowledge about different cultures, and at the same time go deep in one or two specific culture that the learner himself is interested in. In this way we can meet the needs of the community, meet the local community, the needs of the global community, and the needs of the individual himself or herself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nazmi. I'll take the floor and continue on. Just to finish off this point that we've been discussing, I think our friend in Bristol made a really important point about the ubiquitous nature of English, that it's spoken in so many different places. And the reading that we gave you by Kanagaraja talks about this different aspect of English, that English is used by so many different speakers around the world. So how can we talk about a particular type of English? And just being a little bit critical of the position of British English and American English, there are actually so many Englishes. So have a read of Kanagaraja, the one we suggested, but also there's a 2013 article by him that takes this idea even further, talking about the different Englishes that some of the people he did some research on are using and how they understand those Englishes in communication. And that's 2013 in the journal Language and Intercultural Communication. So I think that addresses this discussion very nicely. Okay, let's continue to the next part. But before we do, I just want to introduce my lovely colleague who's just arrived. This is Oakley. Do you want to say something about your bilingual status?
Yes, sure. I grew up in France, but with an American mother and a British father, so my American and English language is very mixed. And I think it kind of emphasizes that idea of the complexity in a way of the association between culture and language. And the fact, so yes, that's a brief introduction.
And Oakley grew up in France, so she's French speaking too. Okay, thanks everybody. Let's carry on then. So we're moving on to the next part, looking at languages in the research process. And we're coming here to the research project that we're all involved with Nazmi and why we're here today. So moving on to the next slide, slide 23, where we're looking at languages under pressure and pain. So this slide really just focuses on what the project is interested in. So we're looking at the idea that borders raise issues around security and insecurity, and then what are the practical and ethical questions around how research might be conducted. And so Jane and I are looking at, along with Mariam, are interested in the processes and the methods and the methodologies of researching where multiple languages are present, but also where researchers themselves are drawing on their multiple language resources. So our project is comparing discipline-specific methods. We're also looking at the arts and humanities methods where the body and body politic are under threat. And Nazmi's TASOL project is really important there in thinking about multimodality and language learning. And we're looking at theoretical and methodological insights. Okay, so the idea that there are pockets of work in disciplines, but no overarching framework across multiple disciplines. So we're kind of interrogating that position. Next slide, the aim of the Researching Multilingually network project. So what we're trying to do, Jane, Richard, Mariam and I, is to investigate and clarify the epistemological and methodological processes of researching in more than one language. So not just in dialogue and observation and text, but also how they're mediated, and even thinking about multimodal methods too, the creative arts. And what are those implications for how researchers undertake their research of practice, how they design their project, what kinds of methods and instruments they're using, how they go about collecting their data and generating it, what languages do they use, how do they transcribe and translate, and what about the interpreting and then the actual reporting back and the presenting their research. So what opportunities, affordances, challenges, obstacles and possibilities arise in all of that. The next slide, what is the definition of researching multilingually? So thinking about what it means in our research projects to use multiple languages. So how do researchers draw on their own and other multilingual resources in the researching, reporting and representation of people where multiple languages are at play? The next slide, thinking about the research process. So we're looking at, in our work, from the actual inception or development of a research project to designing the project itself, thinking about the lit review. What languages might you use in your lit review? What research questions are you going to look at that deal with the different languages? What about the framework, the choice of methods? What ethical issues do you need to think about in engaging everybody in your research project, whether it's just your participants, but also the people who are funding your research and who are hearing about your research? What about your own positioning? What languages do you bring to the research site? How are you going to think about those and your own subjective involvement in the research site? Analysis, and then how will you present your research to all the stakeholders involved? Okay, so the questions that we're looking at in our project, how do researchers generate, translate, interpret and write up data from one language to another? What ethical issues emerge for you when you're planning it and when you carry out your data collection? And then when you present your findings, whether it's through text in publications, whether it's by way of a film, or is it some kind of performance? And how do you integrate the multiple languages into your research? What particular methods and techniques might improve these processes? And then, of course, this fourth one, which is italicized, how does multimodality, that's very much the kind of thing that Gaza's interested in thinking about multilingual researcher praxis. And then how can researchers develop